Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. The word terrorism gets thrown around a lot, usually following a crisis. Islamic terrorism, right-wing terrorism. Now, why they do this makes sense. Terrorism is a scary word, implying deliberate action on the part of its perpetrators to inflict fear plus uncertainty, to inflict terror, usually through mass murder, wanton destruction of property, or other acts of violent aggression. But provoking emotions isn't an end unto itself. The terrorist wants the terrorized to react, to alleviate their anxiety. The simplest way to do that? Well, terrorists usually have demands, or justifications for their actions. Compliance with their demands, therefore, should mean they have no cause for aggression. What's interesting is what the terrorist is confessing through their acts of terror. According to them, their desired outcome cannot be achieved through persuasion or through non-aggressive acts of direct action. They confess their desired outcome can only be achieved through violence and coercion. Now, isn't that interesting? If people are free to choose, the terrorist knows, whether consciously or unconsciously, that if they just asked, people would tell him to take a hike. Sure, he could get a couple people, but hardly enough to bring about his desired outcome. As such, his only means of meeting his interests is at the direct expense of other people, who can only be bullied, frightened, and coerced to meet his preferences. Well, hold on a second. This sounds familiar. Seeking compliance with opinions through force? Where have I heard this before? Oh, now I remember. This is exactly what the statist priesthood does. You see, when a politician makes a policy proposal, what they're stating is an opinion they know nobody would go along with voluntarily. After all, if people were to go along with it voluntarily, making it mandatory through legislation and forcing people to pay for its enforcement against their will through taxation wouldn't be necessary. So a terrorist uses force to get his way, and a politician uses force to get their way. The only real difference is that a politician is better at what they do, since they can convince millions of people that their victimization is in their interest. As the terrorist has conflicting vision for a coerced society than that of the states, its politicians and media pundits can propagandize to people how the terrorist seeks to do them harm without any introspection whatsoever into how politicians do the exact same thing, just that they're more subtle about it. Of course, what I'm describing is how people act. Well, let's make it simple. What is terrorism? Political violence. More specifically, the use of the initiation of force in order to achieve political objectives. Now, what is politics? This definition is more ambiguous, as philosophers have tried to answer it for centuries. But by observing the actions of people participating in politics, we can get an answer. Hence, why talking about the people was important earlier. Politicians initiate violence in gaining resources and deciding how to use other people's resources. Thus, the best definition I can conceive of for how politics is as follows. Politics is the science of how to allocate scarce resources using violence. Politics is violence. So if all politics is violence, then political violence means violent violence. It's redundant, but anyways, we can simplify it to just mean terrorism is violence. But politics is violence. So if terrorism equals violence and politics equals violence, then politics equals terrorism. If A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. In math, this is called the transitive property of equality, but in the context of our discussion, it means there is no logical difference between acting politically and acting terroristically, assuming that's even a word. This is reflected in how governments act. If they catch you violating their legislation, men with guns will come to throw you into a cage. If you resist, they'll escalate force until you comply or die. Though sometimes even compliance isn't enough to spare your life. Terror is the fear of arbitrary consequence, and what is more arbitrary than holy government edict? The state doesn't try to persuade you or make compliance in your interest. They scare you into obedience, indoctrinate you into associating feelings of loneliness and anxiety with disobeying the state. Most of us who went to government school, who's ever gotten in trouble with teachers or administration, knows the feeling. So much so that when we see others disobey, we experience that anxiety and are compelled to come to the state's defense. This is terrorism, with the added bonus of indoctrinating people into becoming terrorists themselves. It'd be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. Politicians and their media hand puppets decry terrorism, tell us to be worried about people being radicalized into domestic terrorists, foreign terrorists, who kill in the name of their evil death cult or political cause. It goes without saying, of course, that terrorism is always wrong, as it initiates force. But if that's true, then the same is true for politics. Now, not all violence is terrorism, obviously. Self-defense is perfectly legitimate. But the reason the state decries terrorism is because the state doesn't want competition. Questions, comments, critique? What do you think about this quickie video format? What are your thoughts about